There are moments when America reveals itself without warning. Moments when the promise written on paper collides with the reality lived in flesh and bone. Moments when dignity is stripped away, not in secret, not in darkness, but under bright, fluorescent lights in front of strangers, cameras, and children. This is one of those moments. Picture this: a black man in a suit, a respected federal agent, 26 years of service protecting civil rights, and yet he's on his knees on a grocery store floor, a gun pointed at his chest, because someone decided his skin made him suspicious. No crime, no threat, just existence. This story is not easy to hear. It will make your chest tighten. It will make your hands clench. It may even make you angry. But it must be told. Because what happened to Ethan Brooks didn't happen in isolation. It happened because silence has been allowed to grow louder than justice. Because racism doesn't always scream. It sometimes whispers, hides behind procedure, and wears a badge. And here's the question that should haunt all of us. If this can happen to a man who spent his life defending the law, what happens to those without power, without witnesses, without a name anyone recognizes? This video is not just about a racist cop. It's about courage under a gun, friendship forged in fire, a town forced to confront its darkest truth, and the painful, hopeful question of whether America can still choose to be better. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe silence protects injustice, if you believe love, accountability, and truth can still build a stronger America, subscribe now to the Racist Reality Channel. Stay with us. Watch to the end, because this isn't just a story about what went wrong. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to let hatred have the final word. A gun in the frozen aisle. There are moments that divide a life cleanly in two. The moment before, when you still believe your education, your service, your years of discipline can shield you. When you believe that doing everything right must count for something. When you trust, just a little, that the country you've given your life to will recognize you as one of its own. And then there is the moment after, when you understand that none of it matters if someone decides you are a threat. This is the story of that moment. Ethan Brooks did not wake up that morning expecting to become an example. At 52 years old, with 26 years in the FBI's Civil Rights Division, he had long learned how to move quietly through the world. The work he did was rarely public. It lived in affidavits and sealed reports, in late-night phone calls to grieving families, in the long silence after a witness finally said, "Yes, I'll testify." That Tuesday in Rockford, Ohio, had been brutal even by his standards. 14 hours of interviews, 14 hours of charred photographs, 14 hours of listening to black business owners explain how their livelihoods had been reduced to ashes while authorities labeled it unfortunate accidents. Ethan knew better. He always did. Patterns had a smell to them, and hate left residue. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of Lakeview Market, the sky had darkened into a dull winter blue, the kind that pressed low against the city. Sodium lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of cars dusted with road salt. He sat behind the wheel longer than usual, loosening his tie, rubbing his temples where the headache lived now as a permanent tenant. Dinner. That was all he wanted. Something simple. Something normal. He stepped out into the cold, the air biting through his coat, and walked toward the sliding doors with the practiced posture of a man who knew how easily confidence could be mistaken for defiance. Inside, warmth swallowed him. The familiar grocery store orchestra played around him. The whine of freezer compressors, the dull rattle of carts, the distant beeping of a register. He grabbed a basket, then a cart, deciding halfway through that he might as well stock up. He moved methodically, automatically. Pasta, sauce, garlic bread. Normal things. That was when the feeling arrived. Not a sound, not a voice, just the weight. It settled between his shoulders the way it always did, that unspoken pressure that came from being watched not with curiosity, but with suspicion. Ethan didn't look up right away. He never did. Experience had taught him that meeting the stare too soon sometimes made it worse. At the front of the store, a young cashier stood frozen behind her register. Knew he could tell. Her name tag sat crooked against her chest. She watched him compare labels in the frozen aisle, watched him pause, watched him think. To her, thinking looked like planning. 15 minutes earlier, she had picked up the phone with shaking hands. "There's a man here," she whispered to dispatch. "I don't know. Something feels off." "What's he doing?" the dispatcher asked. "Well, just looking around." "Can you describe him?" There was a pause. "He's black, tall, wearing a suit." That was enough. Ethan bent to reach into the freezer case, debating chocolate or vanilla, unaware that somewhere between the ice cream novelties and frozen vegetables, his ordinary evening had already been transformed into a threat assessment. The sliding doors hissed open behind him. He saw the reflection first, warped slightly in the freezer glass. Navy uniform, badge catching the light, a hand resting too comfortably on a holster. Officer Kyle Mercer entered the store with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this would end. 29 years old, 3 years on the force, 6 complaints buried quietly where no one had to answer for them. He moved with his shoulders squared, boots striking tile harder than necessary, claiming space that wasn't his by right, only by permission. Ethan straightened slowly and placed the ice cream into his cart. He didn't rush. He didn't freeze. He did what his father had taught him decades earlier. Be calm, be visible, be careful. Kyle stopped less than 2 feet away. "Hey," he said, voice sharp, "let me see some ID." No greeting, no explanation, just a command dropped like a weight. Ethan rested both hands on the cart handle, palms open. "May I ask why, officer?" he said evenly. "I'm just grocery shopping." Kyle's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked over Ethan's suit, his posture, his composure. "We got a call about suspicious activity," he said. "You match the description." Ethan felt it then, the familiar sinking realization. "What suspicious activity?" he asked, specifically. Around them, movement slowed. A woman stopped mid-aisle. A man pretended to check his phone while angling the camera just enough. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something urgent and fearful. Kyle's thumb moved closer to the snap on his holster. "You questioning my authority," he snapped. "Show me your ID. Now." In that instant, Ethan was no longer a federal agent. He was 8 years old again, standing in his father's study, listening as a man who loved him tried to explain how to survive encounters like this. Speak clearly, move slowly, never assume they see you the way you see yourself. "Officer," Ethan said quietly, every word deliberate, "I'm going to reach for my wallet very slowly." Kyle's fingers curled around his weapon. "Any sudden move," he warned, "and I promise you'll regret it." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands did not shake. Fear, he had learned, was not the same as panic. Panic got you killed. His fingers brushed the inside of his jacket. The gun came out. Metal scraped metal, a sound so sharp it cut through the store's background noise and left silence in its wake. "Hands up," Kyle shouted. "On your knees, now!" The muzzle of the weapon pointed directly at Ethan's chest. Time slowed to something thick and heavy. Ethan lowered himself to the cold linoleum, knees protesting, suit pants creasing where dignity bent under command. He kept his eyes up, his hands visible, his breathing controlled. "Officer," he said clearly, loudly enough for the phones now openly recording, "I am a federal agent with the FBI. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket." Kyle laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Yeah, right," he sneered. "You people always say something fancy when you get caught." The words landed harder than the threat. Kyle stepped closer, the gun wavering just slightly, and leaned down until his voice dropped to something meant to disappear into memory. "Touch that pocket," he whispered, "and I'll say you went for a weapon." Ethan swallowed. This was how it happened. Not in a dark alley, not during a raid, but under fluorescent lights, between frozen dinners and discounted pizzas, with witnesses who would later say they'd been scared too. He thought of his wife, Sarah, her laugh, the way she'd worried every time he left for work, even after years of reassurance. He thought of his daughter, Maya, still in law school, still believing the law could be shaped into something just. And as he knelt there, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting civil rights one truth cut deeper than the gun ever could. If this was how easily his humanity could be stripped away, then this country was asking far too many people to survive on faith alone. The store felt smaller, colder, and somewhere in that tightening space, America revealed itself, not as it promised to be, but as it still was. Two men, two Americas. The gun never left Ethan Brooks's chest. Even as minutes stretched into something unbearable, even as the crowd shifted and whispered, the barrel stayed trained on his heart as if it belonged there, as if this moment had been rehearsed long before he ever walked into Lakeview Market. Ethan knelt on the linoleum, knees aching, suit fabric creasing under the weight of submission he had not chosen. He kept his hands visible, fingers spread, muscles trembling, just enough to remind him he was still human. Officer Kyle Mercer stood above him, breathing faster now, the adrenaline thick in his voice. To Kyle, the scene had already rearranged itself into a story he understood. A dangerous man, a decisive cop, control restored. What Kyle did not see, or did not care to see, was the difference between authority and fear. Ethan knew that difference intimately. He had spent his life studying it. From the outside, Ethan Brooks looked like the embodiment of achievement. A federal agent, educated, respected. His career wall back home held commendations from directors, letters from judges, framed newspaper clippings of cases that had forced change where silence once lived. But kneeling there, he understood the cruel arithmetic of race in America. 30 years of service minus black skin still equaled suspicion. The ache in his chest was not just fear, it was grief. Grief for every time he had believed progress meant protection. Kyle shifted his stance, boots scraping against the floor. He took in Ethan's calm voice, his careful grammar, his refusal to beg, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. Kyle Mercer hated this kind of calm. It made him feel small. He had grown up in Rockford's South End, the son of a man who taught him that the world was taking something from him every day. Those jobs were disappearing. That respect was being handed out unfairly. That men like him had to take back what was owed. The academy had taught him procedures. The streets had taught him power. And power, Kyle believed, was something you asserted before it was taken from you. He looked at Ethan's tailored suit and saw mockery. He heard Ethan's measured tone and felt challenged. Somewhere deep inside, resentment curdled into justification. Men like this always think they're better. Kyle tightened his grip on the gun. "You think you're smarter than me?" he snapped. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Ethan met his eyes, not in defiance, but in recognition. "No, officer," he said softly. "I think we're both standing in a moment that doesn't have to end badly." The words were meant to slow things down. They did the opposite. Kyle laughed again, louder this time, for the benefit of the audience forming behind him. "Always the same," he muttered. "Always got an answer." Around them, Rockford watched itself reflected back in fluorescent light. Some people looked away, pretending the shelves held something more important than a man's dignity. Some leaned in, hungry for the theater of authority. A few felt their stomachs twist, recognizing something deeply wrong, but unsure how to stop it. Fear had a way of teaching silence. Ethan felt that silence pressed against him. He thought of his father again. Not the lectures, but the weariness. The way the man's shoulders slumped after encounters that ended without bruises, but never without cost. "Surviving isn't the same as living," his father used to say. Kyle keyed his radio, voice sharp and performative. "Dispatch, I've got an uncooperative suspect," he said. "Possibly armed, claiming to be federal." The lie slipped out easily. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, not in surrender, but in calculation. Every word spoken now mattered. Every breath. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about the truth no one liked to say out loud, that racism didn't require shouting slurs or burning crosses. Sometimes it wore a badge. Sometimes it hid behind procedure. Sometimes it sounded like just doing my job. Kyle's story was a familiar one in Ethan's line of work. Complaints dismissed, patterns ignored, warnings buried under paperwork and political convenience. Ethan had seen officers like Kyle before. He'd interrogated them, cross-examined them. "I watched them explain away bruises and broken bones as misunderstandings. and he had seen the damage they left behind. Families fractured, communities poisoned, trust eroded until law itself felt like a threat. Kyle gestured sharply. "Hands higher," he ordered. Ethan raised them another inch. The pain in his shoulders flared, but he welcomed it. Pain was grounding. Pain reminded him he was still in control of something. Kyle leaned closer, lowering his voice again. "You know what people like you don't get?" he said. "You don't get how dangerous things are now. Everyone's watching us. Everyone's waiting for us to mess up." Ethan understood immediately. This was not about safety. This was about resentment. "Officer," Ethan said carefully, "I don't want anyone hurt. Not you, not me, not anyone here." Kyle scoffed. "Save it." He yanked Ethan's arms behind his back, the movement sudden and unnecessary. Pain shot through Ethan's shoulders as cold metal bit into his wrists. Gas rippled through the crowd. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that echoed louder than the gun. Ethan inhaled sharply, steadying himself. He did not cry out. He did not resist. He did not give Kyle the satisfaction of seeing him break. In that restraint lived a quiet, devastating truth. Black dignity in America had always required extraordinary discipline. Kyle straightened, surveying the scene as if he'd won something. "There," he said loudly. "That's how this goes when you don't cooperate." Ethan stared at the floor, not in shame but in sorrow, because he knew this scene was playing out somewhere else at the same moment. In another town, another store, another traffic stop, different names, same ending. A man stripped down to suspicion, a system confident it would protect its own. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the anger, Ethan felt something else begin to rise. Resolve. If this was the cost of truth, he would pay it. If this moment could expose something larger than itself, he would endure it. Because somewhere beyond the frozen aisle and the watching phones was a country still deciding who it wanted to be. And that decision, Ethan knew, would be shaped not just by men with guns, but by those willing to stand, speak, and refuse to accept injustice as normal, even on their knees. Knees on linoleum. The floor was colder than Ethan Brooks expected. Linoleum had a way of stealing heat quickly, leaching it from bone and muscle until the body understood. This position was not temporary. It was meant to be humble, to dominate, to remind you. Ethan knelt where Kyle Mercer had ordered him to kneel, hands locked behind his back, wrists screaming beneath the bite of steel. The cuffs were too tight. He knew that from experience. He also knew it wasn't a mistake. Across the frozen aisle, time fractured. A woman's cart stood abandoned, frozen peas slowly thawing into a small green puddle. A man near the dairy case held his phone chest high, recording with one hand while his other shook. Somewhere behind the cereal displays, a child asked a question no one answered. The gun never wavered. Kyle stood just far enough away to feel safe, just close enough to feel powerful. His breathing was uneven now, shallow and fast, adrenaline working him into something brittle. Ethan understood that fragility too. Fear, when mixed with authority, could become lethal. "Don't move," Kyle barked again, though Ethan hadn't shifted an inch. "I'm not moving," Ethan replied calmly, making sure his voice carried, making sure it was captured. "I'm complying." Kyle's eyes flicked to the phones, to the crowd, to the woman openly crying near the end of the aisle. He didn't like being watched. He didn't like the idea that his control existed only as long as others believed in it. "Stop talking," he snapped. Ethan fell silent, not because he was intimidated, but because silence, too, could be strategic. The cuffs pressed deeper as Kyle yanked his arms upward, forcing Ethan's shoulders into an unnatural angle. Pain radiated down his spine, sharp and electric. A sound escaped Ethan's chest despite himself. Kyle leaned in, breath hot, voice low. "You want this to get worse?" he whispered. "Because it can get a lot worse." Ethan stared straight ahead, eyes burning, not from pain alone, but from the knowledge of how many men had heard those same words before something irreversible happened. He thought of names. He thought of files. He thought of cases where the story ended with condolences instead of justice. The store manager, Grace Park, pushed her way through the gathered crowd, her face pale but determined. She stopped a few feet from Kyle, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Officer," she said carefully, "this is really unnecessary. He shops here all the time. He hasn't done anything wrong." Kyle turned on her with a glare sharp enough to cut. "Ma'am," he said, "step back. This is police business." "I'm responsible for this store," Grace replied, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "And I don't see any reason for—" "Back, away, now." The threat hung there, heavy and unmistakable. Grace hesitated just long enough to register her defiance, then stepped back, pulling out her phone as she did. Her hands shook, but she held the camera steady. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly knocked the breath from him. Courage, he knew, often looked like fear refusing to sit down. Kyle noticed the phones then. Really noticed them. The way they framed him, the way they captured the gun, the cuffs, the man kneeling in a suit. His jaw clenched. Ethan's eyes shifted just slightly, and that was when he saw it. Kyle's body camera. Dark. No blinking red light. No soft hum of recording. Ethan swallowed, then spoke again, slow and precise. "Officer," he said, "your body camera appears to be turned off. Department policy requires it to be active during civilian encounters." The effect was immediate. Kyle's face flushed, anger blooming hot and fast. "Shut up," he snapped. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." Ethan held his gaze. "I'm stating a fact," he replied, "for everyone's protection." That was the wrong thing to say. Kyle stepped closer, the barrel of the gun lowering until it hovered inches from Ethan's face. The world narrowed to that black circle, to the faint smell of gun oil and sweat. "Here's another fact," Kyle said quietly. "I decide how this ends." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. In that moment, the pain in his wrists faded behind a deeper ache, one that lived in his chest, in his history, in the shared memory of people who had learned that innocence was not always a defense. He thought of his daughter, Maya, studying constitutional law with the optimism of someone who still believed the words mattered. He thought of how many times he'd reassured her that the system, while flawed, could be pushed toward justice. "Not like this," a voice inside him whispered. "Not if it keeps doing this." Kyle turned slightly, keying his shoulder mic again. "Dispatch," he said loudly, performing for the crowd. "I've got an armed suspect refusing to comply, claiming to be FBI, requesting immediate backup." The lie was clean. Confidence. Ethan closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Backup meant escalation. More weapons, more fear, more chances for a mistake that would never be corrected. Kyle's hand tightened on the cuffs again, jerking Ethan's arms higher. "You see what happens when you make things difficult?" he said. A man in the crowd shouted suddenly, his voice sharp with accusation. "That's right. Take him down. Probably trying to rob the place." The words sliced through Ethan. He opened his eyes and saw the man's face. Older, white, jaw set with certainty. No hesitation, no doubt. Others shifted uncomfortably. A few shook their heads, most said nothing. Silence, Ethan knew, was not neutral. It always chose a side. Kyle smirked, emboldened. "See," he said, "people know what you are." Ethan felt something break then, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. It was the last illusion that public respect could be earned simply by doing right. He spoke again, his voice unwavering. "For the record," he said clearly, "I am Ethan Brooks. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Civil Rights Division. I am currently conducting an investigation in this jurisdiction." Kyle laughed, sharp and cruel. "Yeah? And I'm the president," he said. "Get comfortable." The cuffs clicked tighter as Kyle adjusted them, deliberately twisting until pain flared white-hot. Ethan bit down hard, refusing to cry out, because he knew this moment was bigger than pain. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, a lesson about how easily authority could slide into abuse, about how quickly a human being could be reduced to a threat when bias went unchallenged, about how systems that refused accountability taught men like Kyle that there would always be another excuse, another report, another way out. And yet, amid the fear, amid the humiliation, Ethan felt something else growing. Not rage, resolve, because he could feel the eyes on him now, not just watching, but seeing, recording, remembering. This was no longer just his story. It belonged to everyone who had ever knelt where he knelt. Everyone who had ever been told to be grateful for surviving an encounter that should never have happened. Everyone who had been asked to swallow injustice for the sake of keeping the peace. Ethan lifted his chin slightly despite the pain. "If this ends badly," he said quietly, "it won't be because I didn't cooperate." Kyle stiffened. "What did you say?" "I said," Ethan repeated, his voice calm, deliberate, "I am complying, and everyone here can see that." For a split second, uncertainty flickered across Kyle's face, and in that tiny crack, something dangerous entered the room. The possibility that the truth might survive him. The Promise by the River, 1986. Pain has a way of opening doors and memory keeps locked. As Ethan Brooks knelt on the cold linoleum of Lakeview Market, wrists burning, dignity pressed thin beneath steel and suspicion, his mind did what it had learned to do long ago when the present became unbearable. It went backward, not to escape, but to remember why he endured. The frozen aisle dissolved, the fluorescent lights dimmed, and suddenly Ethan was 13 years old again, racing the summer wind down Maple Street in 1986, the cracked pavement of Rockford's east side rattling beneath bicycle tires. "Last one to the river buys sodas," a voice shouted ahead of him. Daniel Price stood up on his pedals, laughing, already pulling away. He was taller even then, all elbows and confidence, shirt flapping loose against the heat. Ethan leaned forward, legs burning, pushing harder, desperate not to lose. They flew past houses that leaned with age, past porches where older men watched the world with narrowed eyes, past yards where laughter and warning lived side by side. Two boys, two dreams. One town was still learning what equality was supposed to look like. Daniel skidded to a stop at the riverbank first, spraying dust. Ethan followed seconds later, breathless and grinning, the taste of summer thick in the air. "You cheated," Ethan accused. Daniel laughed, dropping his bike. "You're just slow." They collapsed onto the grass, staring up at a sky that seemed endless back then. The river moved lazily beside them, carrying secrets and reflections neither of them yet understood. Rockford in the 80s was a place caught between eras. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing. The town wore politeness like a coat that didn't quite fit. Integration had arrived on paper, but not always in practice. Ethan learned early which streets he could ride freely and which ones required speed and silence. Daniel learned something different. His mother cleaned houses for families who never learned her name. His father had left when he was 5. Daniel learned how to speak up, how to occupy space, how to defend what mattered, even when it cost him. They balanced each other that way. By middle school, the world had begun to teach them its lessons more sharply. Ethan remembered the day 3 older boys cornered him behind the gym, their words heavy with contempt, their hands already deciding how far they'd go. Daniel had arrived with a baseball bat and a fury that surprised everyone, including himself. "Back off," he'd said, voice shaking but eyes steady. The boys laughed at first. Then they saw Daniel's grip tighten. They left without another word. Neither of them talked about it afterward. Some things didn't need explaining. Years passed. The river remained. The bikes rusted. Life narrowed their paths but never fully separated them. Ethan's father, the town's first black dentist, insisted on excellence as survival. Books mattered. Education mattered. Knowing the law mattered, especially when it was used against you. Daniel's life was rougher, louder. He worked after school, helped his mother pay bills, learned how easily people underestimated him, and how to use that. The night before Ethan left for college, they sat by the river again, older now, quieter. "I'm going to Howard," Ethan said, skipping a stone across the water. "Pre-law, maybe the FBI someday." Daniel nodded slowly. "Good. Someone needs to make sure the law actually works for people like us." Ethan smiled. "What about you?" Daniel hesitated, then said it plainly. "Police academy, after community college." Ethan stared at him. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Daniel replied. "If we want things to change, somebody has to change them from the inside." The words settled between them, heavy with hope and risk. They clasped hands that night, a silent promise made beside moving water. They didn't know how long it would take. They didn't know how much it would cost. Years unfolded the way they always do. Messy, uneven, relentless. Ethan excelled. Law school, Quantico, long days learning how to stay calm in chaos, how to read people who lied for a living, how to document injustice so thoroughly it couldn't hide. Daniel struggled. He was one of only 2 black recruits in his academy class. Instructors questioned him harder. Fellow officers tested him constantly. He learned quickly when to speak and when silence was the only way forward. They wrote letters, then emails, then texts as technology caught up with time. Ethan sent postcards from places marked by pain, towns where hate wore masks, where crosses burned quietly, where victims needed someone to listen. Daniel sent messages filled with frustration and resolve. "They think reform is a weakness," one message read. "They think body cams mean we don't trust them. But I'm staying." 25 years later, Ethan stood in the crowd as Daniel Price was sworn in as Rockford's first black police chief. The applause had been polite at first, careful, then louder. Daniel stood taller than ever in his dress uniform, eyes scanning the room until they found Ethan's. For a moment, the years peeled away, leaving 2 boys by a river who had dared to believe something better was possible. As chief, Daniel wasted no time. Body cameras became mandatory. Cultural competency training was expanded. A civilian review board was established, with real authority. Not everyone was happy. 7 officers were terminated in his first 3 years. Complaints resurfaced. Old alliances fractured. Daniel learned quickly that reform created enemies as efficiently as it created trust. Ethan supported him from afar when he could, shared resources, quiet advice, a reminder that standing alone didn't mean standing wrong. Back in the present, on the cold floor of Lakeview Market, Ethan felt that history was like a pulse beneath his pain. He knew Daniel's voice. He knew Daniel's walk. And somewhere beyond the fear and the shouting, he believed, still believed, that his friend would recognize the truth. Because friendship forged in truth did not forget itself. The lesson of the river was not that change was easy. It was that change was possible, when people chose courage over comfort and loyalty over silence. As Ethan opened his eyes again to the frozen aisle, to the gun, to the watching crowd, that lesson steadied him. This moment was not the end of the promise, it was the test of it. And somewhere in Rockford, a man who had once stood on bicycle pedals and laughed at the sky was about to be called back to the river they had never truly left. When the chief walks in, the sound came before the sight. Sirens, brief, controlled, then abruptly cut. The automatic doors at Lakeview Market slid open with a soft, mechanical sigh, and something in the room shifted. Not relief, not yet. Something heavier. Something like recognition. Officer Kyle Mercer felt it too. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened. He glanced toward the entrance, then back down at Ethan Brooks, still kneeling, still cuffed, still breathing with a calm that had begun to feel like an accusation. "Stay where you are," Kyle snapped, as if Ethan had moved. "Don't try anything." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crowd parted instinctively as Chief Daniel Price stepped inside. At 54, Daniel carried himself with a quiet authority that did not announce itself. It simply arrived. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his close-cropped hair threaded with gray at the temples. His uniform was immaculate, but it wasn't the uniform that commanded attention. It was the stillness. Daniel's eyes swept the scene in seconds, trained by decades of command and consequence. The gun, the handcuffs, the phones raised in trembling hands, the man on his knees. And then, recognition. For a fraction of a second, something unguarded crossed Daniel's face. Not a shock, not confusion, pain. But the moment passed. The chief stepped forward, voice steady, measured, carrying across the frozen aisle. "Officer," he said, not raising his voice, "lower your weapon." Kyle turned sharply, surprise flashing across his face before he masked it with defensive posture. "Chief," he began quickly, "I was responding to a suspicious person's call. This individual became uncooperative and—" Daniel held up a single hand. The room fell silent. "Lower," he repeated. Kyle hesitated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A pause that revealed something deeper than confusion. Resistance. Daniel took one more step forward. That was an order, he said calmly. The gun lowered, not all the way, but enough. Daniel moved then, past Kyle, kneeling beside Ethan with deliberate care. He did not rush. He did not touch him yet. He met Ethan's eyes first. Special Agent Brooks, Daniel said formally, though warmth threaded through the words. Looks like grocery shopping got complicated. Ethan swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. Just a misunderstanding, Chief Price, he replied evenly. Officer Mercer seems unconvinced of my credentials. Daniel nodded once, slowly, then stood. He turned to Kyle. Remove the handcuffs, he said. Kyle blinked. Sir, with all due respect, this suspect was... That's not a request, Daniel interrupted. His voice did not rise, but something in it hardened. Remove the handcuffs. Now. Kyle's eyes flicked toward the crowd, then back to Daniel. His jaw worked as if chewing on something bitter. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse. The silence stretched. Phones recorded. History held its breath. Finally, with visible reluctance, Kyle reached for the key. His hands shook as he unlocked the cuffs, metal snapping open with a sound that felt louder than the gun ever had. Ethan rose slowly, rubbing his wrist where red marks already bloomed. He straightened his suit jacket, not to impress anyone, but to reclaim himself. Thank you, Chief, he said quietly. Daniel accepted Ethan's credentials from a rookie officer who had arrived moments earlier, examined them briefly, then returned them with a respectful nod. On behalf of the Rockford Police Department, Daniel said formally, I apologize for this incident. The apology mattered, not because it erased what had happened, but because it named it. Daniel turned back to Kyle. Officer Mercer, he said, step forward. Kyle complied, stiff-backed, eyes burning. Your body camera, Daniel continued. Why is it off? Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. I must have forgotten to activate it, sir. Daniel studied him for a long moment. You must have, he repeated. Then his voice carried across the aisle. You detained a federal agent without cause. You ignored multiple witnesses. You escalated this situation unnecessarily. And you used language and conduct unbecoming of this badge. Kyle's face flushed deep red. Daniel extended his hand. Your weapon and your badge, he said. Now. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kyle took a step back. Chief, you can't? I absolutely can, Daniel replied, still calm. You are suspended pending a full investigation. Hand them over. The store was silent now. Even the hum of the freezers seemed to recede. Kyle's fingers trembled as he unholstered his weapon, removed the magazine, and placed it into Daniel's outstretched hand. Then came the badge. For a moment, Kyle hesitated, fingers lingering on the metal that had given him power. Daniel waited. Kyle unpinned it slowly and handed it over. The badge felt heavier than it looked. Daniel accepted it without triumph, without anger, just gravity. Officer Diaz, he said to one of the rookies, escort Mr. Mercer to the station. He'll complete the necessary paperwork. As Kyle was led away, something broke in the room. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then louder. Some people cried openly. Others stood frozen, stunned by the sight of accountability unfolding in real time. Daniel turned back to Ethan, the formality dropping away. It's been too long, he said quietly, though I wish our reunion had happened under better circumstances. Ethan nodded. So do I. They shared a look heavy with years, with promises kept and nearly broken. Daniel then faced the crowd. I will be reviewing all witness statements and video evidence from this incident, he said. Anyone who recorded, thank you. Your voices matter. Grace Park stepped forward, offering her phone. I also have store security footage, Chief. It covers everything. Daniel accepted it with gratitude. As officers began collecting statements, a veteran cop leaned toward his partner near the back of the store. Wilson, sorry, Mercer's done, he muttered. Third complaint this month. And turning off his body came again? That was Price's policy. His partner nodded grimly. Chief's been waiting for this. Daniel pulled Kyle aside briefly, speaking low enough that the words couldn't be heard, but the meaning was unmistakable. When Daniel turned away, Kyle muttered something under his breath. Daniel stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he turned back. "What was that, Officer Mercer?" Kyle froze. "Nothing, sir." "No," Daniel said evenly. "Repeat it. I want everyone to hear you." Kyle said nothing. "I thought so," Daniel replied, his voice carrying. "Officer Mercer, you have used racially offensive language toward both myself and Special Agent Brooks. That alone disqualifies you from wearing this badge." He looked around the room, meeting eyes. "The badge represents trust," Daniel continued, "and trust, once broken, must be answered for." As Kyle disappeared through the doors, escorted and diminished, Ethan felt a wave of emotion crest inside him. Relief tangled with sorrow, justice tempered by the knowledge of how close this had come to ending differently. By midnight, the footage would go viral. By morning, the nation would argue over what it meant. But in that moment, standing beside his oldest friend in a grocery store aisle, Ethan felt something rare. Not victory, but validation. The lesson was simple and hard-earned. Authority must answer to humanity. Power must bow to accountability. And love, real love for a community, sometimes means confronting it with the truth, even when that truth is painful. Truth goes viral, evil pushes back. By the time Ethan Brooks closed his eyes that night, the story had already escaped him. It lived now in glowing rectangles and scrolling feeds, in headlines that move faster than nuance ever could. Someone had stitched together the footage from Lakeview Market. Kyle's gun, Ethan's knees on the floor, the quiet authority of Chief Daniel Price, and released it into the bloodstream of the internet. The video traveled like lightning. By midnight, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By dawn, it crossed 1 million. By morning, Rockford was no longer a town. It was a battleground for interpretation. Ethan woke in the guest room of Daniel's house on Elm Street, a place filled with warmth and old photographs and the low murmur of a coffee maker. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then the ache in his wrist reminded him. He reached for his phone. Dozens of missed calls, messages stacked like stones. 3 from FBI headquarters, 1 from the Attorney General's office, 17 from his daughter Maya, each more frantic than the last. "Dad, are you okay? Please call me." "I saw the video." Ethan sat up slowly, breathing through the weight that pressed down on his chest. He called Maya first. She answered on the first ring, her voice breaking through the line. "Dad?" "I'm here," he said. "I'm safe." The word safe felt fragile even as he spoke it. They talked for an hour. About fear, about anger, about how close things had come to ending differently. When they hung up, Ethan stared at the wall for a long time, watching the morning light creep across framed photographs of Daniel's family. Downstairs, Daniel sat at the kitchen table in a bathrobe, papers spread before him, his jaw tight. His wife, Renee, moved quietly between stove and counter, setting plates down with care, as if noise itself might provoke something dangerous. "The mayor's office has called 4 times, Daniel said when Ethan entered. "They're worried about lawsuits, tourism, reputation." Renee snorted softly. "Funny how justice never tops the list." Daniel rubbed his eyes. "Internal Affairs is here already. FBI too." Ethan nodded. "Standard procedure." He didn't say the rest. That standard procedure often arrived late and left early when power felt threatened. The press descended by mid-morning. Cameras crowded the sidewalk outside the house, reporters rehearsing questions about race and law enforcement as if they were separate topics. Ethan declined interviews. He wasn't ready to become a symbol. He had spent his career chasing symbols back down to facts. Inside the police department, the mood shifted from shock to resistance. Some officers stopped making eye contact with Daniel. Others wore small blue pins on their lapels, a quiet sign of solidarity with Kyle Mercer. A few left anonymous notes on desks. "You went too far. You're betraying your own." Daniel collected the notes without comment, stacking them neatly in a drawer. He had learned long ago that anger revealed itself most clearly when it thought it could hide. Then came the threats. Grace Park called first. "There was a cruiser outside my house last night," she said, her voice tight. "It drove by 3 times, slow." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You did the right thing," he told her. "We'll make sure you're protected." An hour later, another witness reported the same thing. Then another. Patterns again. By noon, Daniel received a call from his deputy chief. "Sir," she said quietly, "someone accessed the personnel file server overnight." Daniel straightened. "What was taken?" "All disciplinary records related to Kyle Mercer," she replied. "They're gone." Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. "Backups? Also wiped?" Silence stretched between them. "Whoever did this," she added, "knew our system." Daniel ended the call and stared at the wall. This was no longer about one officer. This was about protection. That afternoon, Ethan met with the FBI team assigned to the case in a temporary satellite office. Whiteboards filled quickly with names, dates, connections. Hate crimes across northern Ohio. Black-owned businesses vandalized or burned. Complaints dismissed. Officers reassigned instead of disciplined. It formed a shape Ethan recognized. A system defending itself. His phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Brick through my kitchen window last night. Note attached. 2 words, race traitor." Ethan closed his eyes. They were escalating. The lesson Ethan had learned the hard way pressed forward now with brutal clarity. When truth threatens power, power rarely surrenders quietly. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the office lights hummed overhead, Ethan worked through files with the focus of a man who knew the cost of hesitation. The past day replayed in his mind: the gun, the cuffs, the silence of the crowd. Silence had been the system's greatest ally for decades, but silence had cracked, and cracks frightened people who benefited from darkness. At 7:43 p.m., the lights went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, cutting the hum of electronics mid-breath. The building across the street remained lit. Isolated outage. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Stay close," he murmured to the agent beside him. Glass shattered at the rear entrance. Footsteps followed, deliberate, heavy. Ethan's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. This wasn't random. Someone wanted to scare them. Or worse. The sound of breaking doors echoed through the hallway. "FBI!" Ethan shouted. "Drop your weapons!" The response came in gunfire. The first bullet slammed into a filing cabinet inches from Ethan's head, spraying metal shards across the floor. He dove for cover, returning fire with controlled precision. Training took over. Angles, distances, breathing. The attackers moved with purpose but not discipline. Someone shouted. Someone cursed. Another bullet punched through drywall. Ethan fired twice, forcing them back. Moments later, sirens approached. Too fast to be coincidence. The attackers fled. By the time backup arrived, the building smelled of smoke and fear. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. They weren't just being watched anymore. They were being challenged. That night, FBI Director Collins called Ethan personally. "Reynolds, sorry, Brooks," he corrected himself. "We're escalating. Full task force. This is now an attack on the federal government." Ethan listened, jaw set. "Understood," he said. "We won't back down." Across town, Kyle Mercer watched the footage of his suspension replay on television, his jaw clenched in resentment. His phone buzzed constantly, messages of support from sympathetic officers, from online groups eager to recast him as a victim. Then his phone rang. He recognized the number immediately. "Keep your mouth shut," said the voice on the other end. "Lay low. We're handling it." Kyle leaned back, a smile creeping across his face. "Good," he said, "because this isn't over." What neither man fully grasped yet was how far the lines had already been drawn. Truth was no longer a file or a video. It was a choice. And the cost of that choice was about to rise. The lesson pressed itself into Ethan's bones as he sat in the darkened office later that night. Lights restored, guards posted at every entrance. Racism did not always announce itself with hatred. Sometimes it arrived quietly, with protection and excuses and erased records. And the only thing more dangerous than confronting it was pretending it would go away on its own. The night the lights went out, the first thing Ethan Brooks noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that settles gently over a room when work is done, but the sudden, unnatural kind. The kind that arrives without permission and leaves the air hollow. The lights went out at 7:43 p.m. 1 second, the FBI satellite office hummed with the low, steady rhythm of machines and murmured voices. The next, everything vanished. Screens black, printers dead, the soft buzz of electricity cut mid-breath. Darkness swallowed the room. Ethan didn't move at first. He listened. Outside the narrow windows, the streetlights across the road still glowed. A passing car illuminated a brick wall, then moved on. Isolated outage. That detail mattered. "Stay where you are," Ethan said quietly to the agents around him. His voice was calm, but his body had already shifted, muscles tightening, awareness sharpening. His hand drifted toward his holster, not in panic, but in preparation. He had learned long ago that fear was loud, but danger was often silent. Somewhere in the building, glass shattered. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Someone sucked in a breath. Someone whispered a curse. Ethan raised his hand, signaling stillness. "Rear entrance," he murmured. "They cut the power." This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't intimidation for its own sake. This was a message, and possibly something worse. As footsteps echoed down the dark hallway, Ethan's mind ran calculations automatically. Distance, angles, exits. He positioned himself near a filing cabinet, creating cover where there had been none seconds before. He thought of Daniel, likely pacing his own house under police watch. He thought of Grace Park, probably checking her windows again. He thought, unexpectedly, of Maya. The thought hit him hard. His daughter had flown in that morning, refusing to stay away no matter how much he argued. She sat now in a borrowed chair across the room, helping organize case files. Her face lit moments ago by the glow of a laptop screen that was now dark. "Maya," he whispered, barely turning his head. "Get your phone. Quiet." She nodded, eyes wide but focused. She had grown up watching him prepare for danger. She knew when questions could wait. The footsteps grew louder. A door cracked. Then a voice, low, unfamiliar, cut through the dark. "FBI!" Ethan shouted, projecting authority into the shadows. "Drop your weapons!" The answer came in gunfire. The first shot slammed into the filing cabinet inches from Ethan's head, sending metal fragments spraying across the floor. The crack of the gunshot reverberated through the confined space, deafening, violent, final. Ethan dropped behind cover and returned fire with controlled precision. Training took over completely now. He was no longer thinking about the story or the headlines or the cost of exposure. He was thinking about keeping everyone alive. "Maya!" he shouted. "Side door, now!" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then she moved. One of the intruders swung his weapon toward her movement. Ethan fired without hesitation, the shot striking the man in the shoulder. He cried out, stumbling backward into the dark. The second attacker fired wildly, bullets chewing through drywall and desks, shattering equipment that hours earlier had held evidence of corruption and hate. Ethan shifted positions, keeping himself between the attackers and the exit Maya had just disappeared through. He counted shots, waited for the telltale pause that meant a reload. There. He rose just long enough to fire twice, catching the second attacker in the leg. The man screamed, collapsing. Both intruders retreated, dragging themselves down the hallway toward the broken rear door. Within seconds, they were gone. Silence rushed back in, thick and trembling. Sirens wailed in the distance. Too fast, too coordinated to be coincidence. Ethan stayed where he was, weapon raised, breathing slow and measured, until backup flooded the building. Tactical vests, flashlights slicing through darkness, familiar voices calling his name. Only then did the adrenaline loosen its grip. His phone buzzer. "Maya, I'm safe, with Daniel and Renee. I'm okay." Ethan sank into a chair, heart pounding so hard it felt bruised. The cost had almost been unbearable. By the time the building was secured, reality had settled in. What began as racial profiling in a grocery store had now escalated into a direct attack on a federal investigation. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about one officer's resentment. This was about power protecting itself at any cost. Director Collins called again before midnight. "This changes everything," he said grimly. "We're assigning a full task force. This is no longer local. This is federal, and we're not backing down." Ethan stared at the bullet holes in the wall, the shattered glass glinting under restored lights. "Neither are we," he replied. Across town, Maya sat at Daniel's kitchen table, wrapped in a borrowed sweatshirt, hands still shaking despite her effort to steady them. Renee poured her tea she didn't drink. Daniel stood by the window, jaw clenched, watching squad cars pass. "I should have been there," Daniel muttered. "You were where you needed to be," Maya said quietly. Her voice surprised them all. Firm, resolute. "This is bigger than one of us now." Daniel looked at her, seeing not just Ethan's daughter, but the future pressing forward whether anyone was ready or not. The lesson of that night would ripple far beyond Rockford. It would be misunderstood by some, twisted by others, but its truth was unavoidable. When systems of injustice are challenged, they do not retreat peacefully. They test resolve. They exploit fear. They aim not just to silence voices, but to make examples of those who speak. And yet, that night also revealed something else. Courage multiplies. It spreads from a man who refuses to bow on a grocery store floor, to a chief who refuses to protect wrongdoing, to a store manager who lifts her phone, to a daughter who runs toward danger instead of away from it. The lights had gone out, but something far more powerful had ignited. A refusal, a line drawn, a truth that would no longer stay buried in the dark. The badge, the town, the future. The town hall filled long before the doors officially opened. By sunset, the parking lot outside the Rockford Community Center was a constellation of satellite trucks, their dishes tilted skyward like metal flowers seeking signal. Cameras crowded the sidewalks. Police tape marked perimeters that felt both protective and accusatory. Rockford had never seen anything like this. Inside, the air vibrated with anticipation and fear. Fear not of violence alone, but of truth. Truth had a way of rearranging lives, and everyone in that room understood that something permanent was about to happen. Ethan Brooks arrived quietly, flanked by federal agents whose presence alone sent a ripple through the crowd. He wore a dark suit, conservative, unremarkable, on purpose. He didn't want to look like a hero. He wanted to look like what he was, a man insisting on accountability. Chief Daniel Price entered moments later, steady and unmistakably calm. Some people applauded. Others sat stiffly, arms crossed. Trust once broken, never returned all at once. At the front of the room, a long table waited, microphones, folders, water glasses no one would touch. To one side sat Kyle Mercer, flanked by an expensive attorney flown in from Columbus. Kyle's posture radiated defiance, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear wrapped in resentment. A few rows behind him, former police officials and city power brokers filled seats with practiced neutrality. Mayor Richard Halstead arrived last. He smiled too much. When the clock struck 7, Daniel stepped to the podium. The room fell silent. "What happened to Special Agent Ethan Brooks at Lakeview Market?" Daniel began, his voice carrying easily. "Was not an isolated incident. It was a mirror." He paused, letting the words settle. A mirror reflecting years of unaddressed bias, unchallenged misconduct, and a system that too often protected power instead of people. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel outlined the evening's structure. Evidence, testimony, accountability, next steps. Kyle's attorney objected immediately, his voice sharp. "This is a public spectacle," he said. "My client is entitled to due process, not a public lynching." The word landed heavily. Daniel did not flinch. "This is not a trial," he replied evenly. "This is transparency, and this community has waited long enough for it." Ethan stood next. For a moment, the room forgot to breathe. The man who had knelt on a grocery store floor now stood upright, composed, unshaken. His voice when he spoke was calm, not because he felt calm, but because calm was how truth survived hostile rooms. "My team and I have conducted a comprehensive investigation," Ethan said, "not only into Officer Mercer's conduct, but into a pattern of behavior within the Rockford Police Department spanning several years." Screens behind him lit up. Charts, timelines, names. Between 2020 and 2024, complaints filed by Black residents were dismissed at nearly double the rate of those filed by white residents. Officers with repeated allegations were reassigned, not disciplined. Body cameras were mysteriously disabled in encounters that later became complaints. A low hum of disbelief spread. Ethan continued, each word measured. We also uncovered financial connections between former police leadership, city officials, and private developers who benefited after Black-owned businesses were vandalized or destroyed. Incidents repeatedly labeled accidental despite clear evidence of hate-based motives. Faces paled. Bank records appeared, property transfers, emails. The story that had once seemed complicated suddenly became disturbingly clear. Kyle shifted in his seat. His attorney whispered urgently, scribbling notes that grew increasingly frantic. Then Daniel returned to the podium. He nodded once. To the sound technician, the audio played. Kyle's voice filled the room, unmistakable. Keep the pressure on that neighborhood. They'll move eventually. Another voice, older, authoritative. Turn off the cams if you have to. We can clean up paperwork later. The room erupted. An elderly Black woman stood shakily, gripping the back of her chair. That's him, she said. That's the officer who tore my car apart coming home from church. They told me there was no record of the stop. Her voice broke. Then another person stood, and another. A teacher, a shop owner, a teenager's mother. Stories poured out of humiliation, fear, intimidation, retaliation. Each testimony stacked upon the last, forming a truth no one could dismiss as coincidence. Kyle's attorney leapt to his feet again. This is outrageous. Kyle stood too, his face twisted with fury. This is all because of him, he shouted, pointing at Ethan. You're all taking his word because he's federal and knows the chief. I was protecting this town. From what? Ethan asked quietly. The question cut deeper than any accusation. Kyle's response came without thought, a racial slur. It echoed through the room, captured by every microphone, every camera, every stunned breath. Silence followed, the kind that does not pass unnoticed. Daniel stepped forward. Officer Mercer, he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, you have violated the trust of this community repeatedly. State police moved closer as Kyle tried to step back. One of his allies attempted to pass him a flash drive. They were stopped immediately. Add obstruction of justice, the state attorney general said calmly from her seat. Daniel walked toward Kyle, slowly, deliberately. He reached out and unpinned the badge from Kyle's chest. The metallic click echoed through the hall. Your actions have dishonored this badge, Daniel said, and everything it stands for. Applause erupted, not celebratory but cathartic, years of silence breaking into sound. Kyle was led away, his face a mixture of rage and defeat. Ethan returned to the podium one final time. What happened to me was not unique, he said. The difference is that I had the resources to fight back. Many do not. He looked directly into the cameras. Justice is not revenge, it is restoration. And restoration begins when we choose to see each other as fully human, before uniforms, before titles, before fear. In the months that followed, Rockford changed. Kyle Mercer and several others faced federal charges. Former officials resigned. A civilian oversight board with real authority was established. Training changed. Leadership changed. Grace Park was elected mayor. Trust began its slow return. 3 months later, Ethan stood before a new class of police cadets. The badge you received today, he told them, is not a shield from accountability. It is a promise. In the front row, Maya Brooks listened, pride shining through tears. Later, over coffee at Lakeview Market's renovated cafe, she slid 3 envelopes across the table. Law school acceptances. I want to fight this from the inside, she said. Ethan smiled, heart full and aching all at once. Across town, Daniel hung a photograph in his office. 2 boys on bicycles, 1986, by a river. Beside it, a newspaper clipping of 2 men, older now, steadier, standing together at a graduation ceremony. Outside, a patrol car passed slowly. Inside it, 2 young officers, one Black, one Latina, offered a respectful nod. Ethan and Daniel watched from the porch, glasses of lemonade sweating in their hands. Think we made a difference? Ethan asked. Daniel considered the quiet street. We kept the promise, he said, and we made room for the next generation to keep going. The lesson of Rockford was not that America was perfect, it was that America was unfinished, and that rejecting racism, choosing love, and helping one another was not weakness. It was the work. The work of building something stronger, together. What happened in this story was never just about one officer, and it was never just about one town. It was about a truth that many people live with quietly every day. The fear of being seen as a threat before being seen as human. The exhaustion of having to prove your worth before you're granted dignity. The pain of knowing that the system meant to protect you can sometimes be the very thing you must survive. But this story is also about something else. It's about courage, the kind that doesn't shout, but stands firm on shaking knees. It's about love, not the easy kind, but the disciplined kind that chooses justice over comfort. It's about connection between friends, between neighbors, between generations who refuse to pass hatred down as inheritance. Ethan did not win because he was powerful. He survived because people chose to see him, to stand with him, and to tell the truth when silence would have been safer. And that is the lesson for all of us. A stronger America is not built by denying racism exists. It is built when we reject discrimination, when we help one another, when we hold power accountable, and when we remember that every person we encounter carries a life just as complex, just as valuable as our own. Change does not begin in courtrooms or headlines. It begins in moments, when we speak up, when we record the truth, when we refuse to look away, when we choose empathy over fear. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it reminded you that justice is possible when ordinary people act with integrity, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel. Visit the channel, watch more stories, share them, talk about them. Because these narratives are not meant to end when the video does. They are meant to live on, in conversations, in choices, in the way we treat one another. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for choosing humanity. And remember, real change begins when we refuse to accept injustice as normal and choose love as an action.